It up with the Stranger Things. Have you seen that? Have you seen that with the Stranger Things? Are you ready for Stranger Things to come out?
Being a streamer and being a YouTuber are two of the most.
No. I need to find my to watch videos.
In the last 50
Okay.
years, over one.
This is the video I wanted to watch. All right. This is the video I wanted to react to, because I low-key was curious about it. Why giving money to Africa makes it poor? Because we donate money to Africa. We donate money to things. I want to see what this guy has to say and why making money to Africa is quote unquote making it poor.
0.2
No,
trillion.
you know one thing I heard. Like I don't believe it to be true, but like they say, like when you donate to, like when you do like those $X donations and like all those little donations, they just put it back to the company. They don't actually give it to charity. I don't know how true that is, but I'm not really one to believe in shit like that, but I've heard that before, but I don't know.
Dollars of aid money has been poured into Africa, more than the entire GDP of countries like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. When all of this began, just 11% of Africa lived in poverty. But by the 1990s,
I knew that.
after floods of money and global campaigns, that number had actually increased to 66%.
Huh?
Today it stands at 38%.
So they just embezzling?
Over 3 times higher than when the aid program started. In fact, back in the 1950s, the average Western European was just 5 times richer than the average African.
Okay.
Now the gap has more than doubled to
And they be saying Africa poor. Africa not poor. We just don't got the resources. 13 times
Today,
more?
over half of all Africans still live on less than $5.50 a day, and nearly 600 million people don't have access to electricity.
What?
That's not to say this is an entirely recent phenomenon.
Bro,
Africa has
what?
always been poorer than the rest of the world, at least for the
Bro, $5.50? You couldn't even get like a whole meal from a fast food place with that paycheck. $5.50? Oh nah.
100 years. But for decades,
Okay,
the West's
I need to
answer
stop
this
pausing
has
it.
been simple. The reason they're poor is because they don't have enough money. And to fix that, we simply just need to give them more. So that's exactly
Okay.
what's happened. Since the 1960s, the amount of aid going into Africa has increased by nearly 120 times.
Yeah,
it's
that's
easy
true.
to see why this
Okay.
is such a popular strategy. It's simple. When we think of aid, we imagine schools being built, roads being paved,
Yes,
children
sir.
being vaccinated. By and large, this is the strategy that
We need
transformed Europe and
infrastructure.
America
That's what you
into the
need.
powerhouses they are
You need
today. But in
infrastructure.
Africa, it doesn't seem to work. The obvious answer that many people turn to is colonialism. Europe wrecked the continent, leaving economic systems so bad that the rise of dictators and corruption was inevitable. And while there's no denying
Man, there be so much corruption in Africa, bro. It's
the
crazy.
fleets of
So
luxury
much
cars,
corruption in Africa,
residential
bro.
jets, while around 30% of
All the
continent
money
lives
investment
without
in
clean
there.
water,
You can make a
certainly
whole
doesn't
video on
help.
that itself.
There's more to the story. And a growing body of research is showing that the money being given to Africa isn't just being wasted, it's actually making the continent poorer. But the truth is that decades of Western involvement might be the one thing holding Africa back. This is how aid laid the foundation for the biggest humanitarian failure of the modern era. For a time, foreign aid was seen as a kind of magic bullet, a
Okay.
surefire way to lift the continent of Africa out of extreme poverty. And to be fair, by the 1960s, there was a good reason to think this. The one major instant where it had been tried, it had worked remarkably well. After
Look at
World
why
War
they got
II,
all those
Europe
white
was
kids in the
decimated.
video.
And all of this came with a massive geopolitical risk. Across Western Europe, communist parties were quickly gaining popularity, and there was a real risk that without a strong economy, Western Europe could turn to communism, or worse, be invaded by the Soviet Union. For the US,
That is
this would have been
scary.
a disaster.
Can you imagine
So
being in war today?
1947, the government announced one of the most
Well, we damn
ambitious
near might be
economic
in war.
programs in human history, the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the US pumped over $13 billion into Europe, roughly $160 billion in today's money. The idea was that by providing Europe with large amounts of cash, America could kickstart
None of that money
investment
went to
in the
Africa,
economy.
man.
And surprisingly,
None.
it worked. In the decade after the Marshall Plan, GDP per capita across the region grew by almost 35%. For the Western world, this was a massive success. But for America,
Of course it was. Where do you think they got all them resources from? That's the part that I hope he touches on that. But there's so much resources that from Africa that United States and Europe took away from. But they don't want to speak on that though.
a turning point. It realized that through aid, it could make countries rich, and in doing so, create both new trading partners and long-term allies in the fight against communism. So after the success of the Marshall Plan, the US looked at another continent, Africa. At the time, the continent was still reeling from centuries of colonialism. In 1960, the average income in sub-Saharan Africa was less than $150 a year, and literacy rates were under 30%, with life expectancy hovering around 45 years. Most of the continent lacked payphones,
Yikers.
electricity grids, or functioning governments. But it also had something America wanted: natural resources. The continent held massive reserves of oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals. With a rapidly growing population, it was seen as a future economic giant. If America could repeat the success of the Marshall Plan, it could unlock a new economic frontier and build a key ally in the process. So
Bro,
money started.
every single person in the world knows Africa's like is the gold mine of resources when it comes to this planet. There's so much minerals on the land of Africa.
That number had increased 40 times to almost 20 billion. Africa quickly became the most aid-dependent region on Earth. And by the 90s, aid money made up over 60% of government budgets in countries like Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But despite this massive injection of cash, things were actually getting worse. In fact, from 1970 to 2000, the average income in Africa declined, despite receiving almost 600 billion over this time period. But rather than changing approach, the West doubled down.
How?
In 2005, the UN launched the Millennium Development Goals, and the G8 promised to double
That
aid
doesn't
to
make
Africa
no
with the end
sense.
of aiming poverty by 2030. This wasn't just a government strategy anymore, it had become a public movement. Campaigns like Comic Relief in the UK, Live Aid, and Band-Aids Feed the World turned Africa into a moral crusade. Ordinary citizens were donating millions, schools held fundraisers, and celebrities sang charity singles, all under the belief that sending money would fix the problem. That all created a powerful narrative, that poverty in Africa wasn't about politics, corruption, or bad governance, it was simply about a lack of money. And if we just gave enough of it, we could solve that problem. By 2010, aid flows to Africa had reached over $50 billion a year, the
Damn.
highest level in history. Yet nearly 2 decades later, those efforts have fallen dramatically short. 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 a day, the highest number in history, and the continent's share of global trade remains below 3%, and many countries now are poorer than when they were in the 1980s. All of that raises the pretty obvious question: why did aid manage to kickstart the European economy?
Being even
totally
poorer
failed
than
to do
back
the same
then,
in
damn.
Africa? Like always, a range of ideas have been proposed, from the continent's geography to its colonial history. But in the last few years, one school of thought has gained particular attention amongst development experts. Their idea is simple. It can all be explained by something economists refer to as institutions. These are the frameworks that govern societies, things like the rule of law, property rights, and democracy. And they might be the single most important factor when it comes to explaining why aid.
See, I agree with that part. Like, with like when it comes to, I think you talk on it, but like institutions, I feel like when entities don't know how to spend the money correctly, and it's just like the structure. Like in America, we have certain structures that allow for things to flourish. Right now, like barring what's happening right now, but like we have certain structures where it allows us to like to go to certain resources. We need hospitals. We need lawyers. We have like that court systems. All of that stuff. I think that's part of the issue too.
When the Marshall Plan began,
Cause money's gotta flow in a certain
Europe
way.
had the infrastructure of functioning states. Ministries, legal systems, and public institutions, though damaged, had existed for decades. These institutions provided the framework needed to rebuild. They could collect taxes, distribute resources, and enforce laws, all essential functions for a stable and functioning society. But in much of Africa, the picture was very different. Most African states had only recently gained independence, and governments were either newly formed or inherited from colonial administrations. But in both cases, the institutions were generally designed for one purpose: to extract wealth. Unlike most Western democracies, states function almost entirely to serve the interests of the ruling elite.
Yep.
Indexes tracking the quality of government institutions have consistently found African countries near the bottom of the list. In 2025, African
See?
nations made nearly half of the bottom 30 countries on the Polity Democracy ranking. It's not hard to imagine why pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into these states goes wrong. Money that was meant to fund roads, schools, hospitals, electrification often goes straight to the hands of the ruling elites.
See what I'm
Presidents
saying?
who fly private
See what
jets
I'm
to
saying?
international conferences, or government ministers spotted wearing $60,000 Rolex watches during anti-poverty meetings. Estimates suggest that the continent loses around 30 billion every year due to corruption, and 30% of all the aid money it receives. Over the past 50 years, this could amount to hundreds of billions of dollars being stolen. But the problem isn't just that this money is effectively being wasted, it also actively supports the very institutions that make development so hard.
Yep.
In a normal democracy, governments
You see
are funded
that?
through taxes, and that creates a two-way relationship between the state and the people. When the people pay taxes, they expect
See, and like that's it's the constant narrative. Like right now in Sudan, that's where my father's from. He's from Sudan. It's all it is they're fighting over gold, the resource of gold, and then power. Because when you get this type of money, you can fund a certain type of lifestyle. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter at that point. So when it comes to Africa, it's a perpetuating cycle: fighting for war, fighting for resources, and then fighting for money. That's all it is.
return. And if the ruling
It's
class
not
fails to
the
provide
people are
this,
just,
then
and
they
then the
run risk of
people who are killed, the
demanding
citizens,
new
they're just
government.
casualties in the
But in
middle of
800
everything.
countries, this accountability mechanism is broken. Because governments receive their funding from foreign donors, it doesn't really matter what the people of the country think. And so corruption is able to persist with very little domestic resistance. This pretty much sums up the continent's political process for the past 50 years. Take Malawi, for example. At various points in the 2000s and early 2010s, foreign aid made up more than 40% of the national budget. But huge amounts of money was being stolen by government officials, paying for things like luxury cars, private homes, or even international shopping trips. You might expect a scandal to spark mass outrage, and after all, the government was siphoning off millions that were meant to serve the public. But that simply never happened, because there was basically no political fallout. As the government's funding came from foreign sources, people most affected by the mismanagement of public funds, Malawian citizens, had very little power to demand systemic change.
Can't do
This
nothing.
isn't unique to Malawi. The same dynamic has been occurring across the continent for decades, and it in part explains why the country still has such high levels of corruption. Of course, some level of corruption exists in basically every country, especially during their early development stages. But even under these circumstances, a country can usually still achieve economic development. Small businesses, farmers, and entrepreneurs can drive progress from the ground up, creating jobs and expanding access to goods and services without relying heavily on the state. But this is another one of the main problems with
Yes,
aid.
sir.
It makes ground up work much, much harder. Because aid makes this route of development far less likely. That's because more often than not, the things being provided by aid organisations are in direct competition with local businesses. Take the textiles industry. By the early 2000s, nearly 80% of the clothing sold in some African nations came from abroad. At first, that might seem like a win-win.
Yeah.
Clothes were cheap, and aid
You can't do
organisations
that's
feel good
tough.
about
It,
reducing
it
waste
drives out
in
the local
countries.
markets
The
that
effect
really
on
want to
local
build a
African
business
industry
in the
was
main
devastating.
cultures.
In Ghana
Yeah.
alone, over 80% of domestic textile factories shut down between 1990 and 2010, which meant thousands of jobs disappearing. And with them, so did the knowledge, machinery, and networks needed to sustain a homegrown industry. In
That
fact,
makes
in the
sense.
last 2 decades, Africa's industrial sector has shrunk from 15% of the continent's economy to now just 10%.
What?
This isn't a coincidence. Academic research
See,
has
like,
found
why are
that
we
on
going
average, foreign aid hurts
backwards? Why are we going
industrialisation in Africa.
backwards?
Even the World Bank, one of the biggest aid organisations in the world, found that periods of increased aid tend to weaken local manufacturing. But it's not just domestic industries that suffer. The
Yep.
entire structure of the economy can be distorted in ways that make economic growth far less likely.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, I feel like I think I realized the conclusion to that, because when you're just throwing money, and that's not really spent in ways to really build like platforms and structures and stuff like that, it just becomes a wasted. It just becomes it just becomes an excess of spending. It's never an excess of like building, because you gotta spend money to make something. If you want to make money, you gotta spend it to build it. So then it's an economic flow. But Africa doesn't have that flow cycle. So I get that. I get that. I get that.
Countries actually grow rich.
I think a lot of people, I wish, thought of it like that, but people don't think of it like that.
Has done so through an export-led model. Nations like South Korea, Taiwan, and China have all seen huge amounts of economic growth in the past few decades, and they did this offering low-cost goods that appealed to Western consumers and then selling them on the international markets. Over time, this allowed them to industrialize, build up domestic industries, and eventually move up the value chain. There is an essential part of the process that people tend to forget: maintaining a weak currency. Doing this makes the country's exports cheaper on the global market,
That's
boosting
true.
demand from foreign buyers. This
And their
increased
dollars are
demand
not
then helps
valuable.
local industries grow, creating jobs and bringing in valuable foreign income, further fueling development. But aid money creates the opposite effect. When money flows into the country, it needs to be converted into the local currency so that governments and aid organizations can actually spend it. But doing this pushes up the price of the currency on foreign exchange markets in response to the high demand. Having a more valuable currency may not sound like a bad thing, but it actually causes a serious problem. A more expensive currency means that for foreigners trying to buy a country's produce, everything suddenly becomes more expensive, so people simply stop buying the produce. For developing economies, this is a total disaster. It means the export-led model that worked so successfully in East Asia becomes impossible to replicate.
Yep.
In Africa today, exports account for about 20% of the average GDP. Less than half of most successful East Asian economies, like Hong Kong, South Korea, or Taiwan. Instead of developing competitive industries and shipping products around the world, aid-dependent countries end up relying on foreign assistance to survive, while their domestic economies remain
They're bound to the
uncompetitive and
hip.
underdeveloped.
They're
Of course,
bound to the
that's not
hip.
to say there's no good that aid can do. In theory, it has the potential to fill crucial gaps in development, things like building roads, schools, and power grids,
True.
all facilitating domestic economic expansion. But that brings us to the final and potentially most serious issue with foreign aid. It almost never effectively delivers. A 2012 report by the Center for Global Development found that up to 70% of aid projects either failed to meet their targets or had no measurable impact. In some sectors, the waste was
70%? That's over 2/3. That's over 2/3 of any aid going into. So 2/3 of billions of dollars are just going wasted. Nah. Can you imagine? You know how much 2/3 of like $500 billion could be
never
due
reached the
to
intended
people?
recipients, lost to theft, mismanagement, or simple logistical failure. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, billions in aid flowed in, yet less than 10% of it reached local institutions. Most was routed through foreign contractors,
See, look at that.
NGOs, or overhead costs.
Look
More
at
than a
that.
decade later, many communities still lack basic sanitation or permanent housing. To understand why, it's helpful to look at the systems that function effectively. Take a business operating in a competitive
That's
market.
insane.
If it provides a bad product, consumers will simply switch to its competitors, and the firm's revenues drop. And if it doesn't make changes, it may even end up going bankrupt. The point is that people who are providing the product are accountable to the people who end up actually using it. But
Indeed.
foreign aid doesn't work that way. If a project fails, the recipients can withhold their taxes or vote for someone else. Because funding comes from foreign governments or donors, there's no mechanism for rewarding success or punishing failure. The result is an enormous lack of incentives to actually do things well. And the story of foreign aid in Africa is not simply one of failure, but of misplaced assumptions. What began as an effort to lift nations out of poverty has
Damn,
created systems
bruh.
of dependence.
This is a
weakened
really good video.
institutions, and stifled local industries. That doesn't mean that aid has no role to play. In moments of crisis, like famine, conflict, or natural disasters, it can provide vital short-term relief. But as a long-term development strategy, the evidence is
So
hard
Darkin?
to ignore. Aid has not delivered the transformation it's promised. If the goal is to support sustainable growth, then the focus needs to shift toward building strong institutions, supporting local business, and creating systems where governments are accountable to their people, not to foreign donors. Because until that happens, the cycle of dependency is just going to continue.
See, when... No, no. No, but the thing is...
In the
See,
loss of
that's upsetting though. Like,
over 1.2
foreign donors can't actually you can't trust foreign donors with money. Like, that's actually so upsetting though. Like, you couldn't trust people in your own country to actually delegate the money correctly so it actually helps people. And sometimes these Western countries and first world countries don't understand that. You know what I mean? But like, yeah, it's disappointing, man. W video. I want to see some of the comments. An economic professor in Sweden once told me, third world aid is when poor people in the rich part of the world give money to rich people in the poor part of the world, man. This is the perfect comment. Third world aid is when poor people in the rich part of the world give money to the rich people in the poor part of the world. So it's just like a money transfer of rich to rich. It's not even poor to poor. It's a rich to rich. The rich gets richer. Honestly, people live their lives off this type of money. Rich people, poor people in the rich part of the world give money to the rich people in the poor part. Yeah, man. As always, Darkin,